Book early on in 1984, but I worked on it in the early 80s, called Let the People Decide, which is a history of community organizing, and it was essentially trying to make sense of what Harry Boyd called this backyard revolution, of the 70s, of people turning to grassroots and neighborhoods as a way of trying to build a social change movement, a mass movement. To be even more successful than in the 60s and 70s were, and to sort of counter some of the errors of organizing in the 60s. And I pretty much have continued, writing material like that. I did an edited book on an ACORN, which 3/4 of the panel participated in, it basically was written at sort of the high point of ACORN, and essentially just trying to make sense of how it was able to achieve all it was able to achieve. So there's really not a critical word in there, pretty much, but it was also because we were trying to make sense of how extraordinary the organization was and how it had been able to achieve those successes. As a historian, I remember two things. The E.P. Thompson quote about the history is the discipline of context, and everything has to be put into its context. I want to sort of put my remarks into contextualize them in terms of comparing ACORN to other kinds of organizations that were comparable, and how ACORN was different. And the other lesson I was supposed to have learned was that we were not supposed to be presentist. That basically, of course, you're always looking at the past through the lens of the present, but really not too much, because that was bad history, which is probably how I ended up in social work. So what I want to do is I want to put ACORN in context, and I want to be presentist, too presentist probably, in terms of trying to look at not only what ACORN was extraordinary with, but perhaps given the events of the last 2 years with the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, etc., what might have been different. And these thoughts come from the conclusion of my last book with other co-authors called Contesting Community, which is the limits and potential of local organizing. And it's both sort of talks about the virtues of community organizing, but also about some of its limits, and has a sort of case study of ACORN in there as well. So the first thing about what kind of sort of lessons to look at in context related to ACORN is this idea of that community matters, but we shouldn't romanticize its potential or exaggerate its limits. So in the field of community organizing for the last 30 or 40 years, there have been a lot who romanticize, the grassroots, romanticize the idea of community. Community is inherently good, and feel that communities on their own can pretty much achieve whatever needs to be done, whether it's social capital kinds of and social capacity kinds of interpretations or others. And then on the left, there's a perspective, perhaps a little bit less common and more marginalized, which basically looked at community as saying, well, it's only grassroots, it's only at the local level, it can't achieve very much at all, and it's just going to fragment people, and it's much a waste of time. I attended a conference in France recently, and that was a very popular critique of community organizing, that would just be disruptive of more state engineering. So what ACORN was able to do was to both acknowledge the importance of grassroots organizing and getting people together at the local level, to having a sort of participatory democracy, at Port's statement slogan at the local level, but also at the same time not exaggerating what the local community could do. So it was always very member-based and grounded in grassroots organizing, but at the same time, as others have said, it always had this sense that you really, if you were interested in bringing about a larger change, you had to basically have an analysis and an organizational structure and a scale that went beyond the local. So ACORN was always heavily rooted in the grassroots. The locals varied in terms of how effective they were. Some were incredibly effective, some were less effective at the local level. But there was also this organizational structure of a powerful, somewhat centralized national organization, which would interact with organizations at the local level, depending on the issues, to provide direction. Direction would come from below. Direction would come from above. I studied with Fred this HR Block campaign years back, and they Don't Be a Blockhead campaign. They organized it from the national level, 55 cities, actions simultaneously. It brought Block to the table in 1 month. It had this sort of clout as a national organization, and it's something that is missing in almost all other community organizations of this era. Some are really anathema to the idea of national centralized disciplined kind of national organization, but ended up making ACORN a critical, as effective and as critical as it was. And I think also in terms of discussions about where do we go in the future with Occupy and other things, is really a part of that conversation that needs to be incorporated. That it may not be just sort of loosely structured, non-disciplined organizational structures are going to be able to bring about the kind of changes we want. ACORN is a model for both a powerful national organization linking with the grassroots local, and the importance of paying attention to this national, this organizational structure of local and national as a key element. The other points in terms of looking at the context of other community organizations are this issue of it being that conflict over power must be a key element. Actions were sort of the lifeblood of ACORN. People viewed ACORN as a group that engaged in protest, even through the 80s and the 90s, where they said, oh, well, that's, passé, that's 60s, we don't do that anymore. We build partnerships now, we build relationships, like they were Esalen institutes, about having community organizing as therapy rather than a struggle. But ACORN didn't do that. ACORN was always focused on building power, and it used conflict not as its sole tool. It basically used it because it wasn't getting attention. People said, well, how come you just didn't write letters, or how come you didn't go and speak to your congressman? Well, because they wouldn't pay any attention to them. So they got attention by using protest and actions as they were necessary. And what was proved, I think, with Occupy and Arab Spring and others is that protest does work, that it does get attention, that those with power don't want the visibility, let alone this massive challenges to their power. The other things that, in terms of putting into context what the field of community organizing, is this idea of building bridges with other organizations and making ties to social movements. And there are some really sectarian kinds of groups, they're not even leftist, in the world of community organizing that pretty much refuse to work with anybody else, and clearly aren't going to work with social movements, which they see as just a bunch of activists who really aren't what community organizing is fundamentally about. And ACORN, as it matured and as it felt it had more strength to be able to do that, began to build much more connections with other organizations so that it could have a greater impact